I'm going to be showing you how you can build forms in React using Formik 2. Now I'm going to just jump right into things. If you want to follow along exactly with my same setup here, I have create React app project up, and I just ran this command, as you can see right here, to create my project. And I used the -- TypeScript flag. You can ignore that if you just want to use JavaScript. And then I also added a couple dependencies that I'm going to use. So I wanted to show how you can actually do this with a real UI. So I'm going to be using Material UI for this. So if you want to follow along, you can use that. But this works with really any UI. If you want to use a different UI kit, or you have your own components, that works too. And so I installed Formik and up along with the Material UI libraries. Alright, so that is all I have set up in the project, and we're just going to get started from there. So the first thing I want to talk about is what we're going to import from Formik. So in Formik 2, there's this new component, or new hook I should say, called useFormik. And I thought I would be using this, but it turns out that it's actually not too useful in most circumstances, because it doesn't allow you to wrap your component in a context, and just kind of one of the limitations of using a hook. So it turns out that I find I'm going to see myself using the Formik component more with Formik rather than the hook. So we're going to be using this, and we're going to start by get rid of this class name. We don't need it. So I'm going to I'm going to create a Formik component here, and this is a render prop. So we're going to put brackets inside of here, and we have a function. And then here we are going to actually display the content of our form inside of this. Alright, so I can have form, and here I want to display a text field, and that's going to be coming from Material UI. And I want to display a button. Actually, we'll come back to the button. Alright, so there's two things that you need to pass into the Formik component. The first is the initial values prop. So these are two required props, I should say. So this is the first required one. And here you just pass in any initial values your form has. In my case, I'm going to say the first name initial value is going to be Bob. And then here I'm going to say onSubmit is the second prop, and this is just a function. This function gets called whenever your form is submitted. Now the first property, or parameter, is the data that your form contains when it was submitted. The second one is an object you can destructure, and you can get access to some extra stuff that Formik has. We're going to come back to this, so you don't really need to worry about it for now. And so I'll just console log the data when we submit. Now Formik is going to give us properties we can access with the parameter of this function here. So I can pass in an object, and if I hit control space, I can see all the things I have available to me. The thing that I care about right now is I'm going to get the values. This will give you an object with the current state of the form. They have a handle change, handle blur, and handle submit. So we can pass in handle submit to our form component here. So on submit, we can pass in our handle submit. And then our text field, and this is just again coming from Material UI. This could be any text field that you like. We're going to pass in an onChange, and this is where Formik is going to handle the function for this. We actually just pass in the handle change here into this handle change, and then on blur we're going to pass in the handle blur. So it's going to handle on change and blur, and then we also need to pass in a value, which is going to be the current value, which we can say values. And then we just need to pass in the name of our text field, or the value it represents. So in this case, this text field is going to represent the first name. And so we also need to pass in what the name of it is. So I'm going to say first name. And this lines up with what you want to be stored in your Formik state. Alright, so let's see this form in action now. So I can see I have Bob displayed here, and I can type, and we have our first input field here. And now if I right click inspect, I can go to my console, and if I type or just hit enter, I can see first name Bob, hello. This is me submitting my form. So it called this right here. Why don't I just put submit? That way it's clear. Now, one thing I'm going to also do in this tutorial is just at the bottom here, display a pre-tag, and I'm going to JSON stringify the values. Now, the reason why I'm doing this, I'm also going to say null, comma 2. This will format it. This will just allow us underneath our form for us to see what the state of our form is as we're doing stuff. Just helpful for debugging. You wouldn't actually display this in your form. So here I can see what these values are as I'm typing and whatnot. All right, cool. So next step is usually you want to add a button to your form to submit it. So this is where we will say button, and from Material UI, submit. And all you have to do is make this the type submit for your button, and that's good to go. You don't need to do anything else. And it's upset with me. I'm not sure why. I think it could just be the Material UI library expects a different format. Oh, I didn't save it, that's all. I just forgot to save my thing. All right, it's happy with me now. TypeScript was just being a little slow. All right, so I can see my submit button, and I can click it, and we can see it here. Also, you notice it gave me initial value of Bob. I didn't really talk about that, but that was what I passed here. Most forms, you are not really going to have an initial value. You could just have it like that. And why don't I put this in a div so it's below. And right, if we click submit, it's going to submit our form. Now, a common thing you may do is when you're submitting your form, usually you have an async request that may take some time to load. You send a request to the server or something. So you can stick that in your on submit, and you may want to say disable your button while it's happening. So a common thing that you may do is there's this function you can call called set submitting. So I can say set submitting is equal to true, and then I can make async call. And then at the end of the async call, when it's all done, right, I can say set submitting is false. And so what that does is it's going to have this is submitting property here or value. It's going to change from true to false. So while the form is submitting, for example, I can disable the button here. So I can say disabled is equal to true if we are submitting the form. All right. You can't really see this, but this can be something you can do to help prevent while you're loading something, they don't just spam the submit button for whatever reason. All right, so that's the set submitting, and there's some other things in here. Like, for example, maybe after you're done with submitting your form, you may want to reset it. So take a look at the properties you have available here. Some of them can be helpful. All right, now it can be kind of cumbersome to pass in, say, the value and the on change and on blur for every single field, right? Because I can just copy this, and I'm going to change the name to last name, and I'm going to change the value to last name, and now I have a first name and last name. You can change it here. And you can see between these two different fields, we have kind of some duplication. So we can simplify this. And the way we can simplify this is with the field component, which is from Formik. All right, so I can say field. And here I can just pass in the name that I want the field to represent, or the value that it matches up with, in this case, first name. And then here I can just specify the type. It's going to be an input field. So give that a save. Now I have two fields here that are mapping to the same value. That's totally fine. You'll notice they're going to sync up. But you notice as I type into this field now, it's updating my first name state here. So that is pretty nifty. So notice how compare this code to this code, we were able to simplify this quite a bit, or at least some of the fields. We don't have to pass in these. Now you'll notice with the field though, it looked ugly, right? It doesn't have our nice UI or Material UI here. So one thing we can do is there's a new prop on the field here called as, and we can pass in the component. So it's now going to use our text field component. So if you accept a value, an on change, and an on blur for your component, you can pass in that component in here like this. So it doesn't matter what it looks like as long as you take those props. So we can get rid of that, and I can get rid of this. So now I have two fields, first name and last name, which we have two input fields here. Right? So hello there. And I don't know, maybe put a placeholder. I actually don't know if placeholders work in Material UI. We'll see. Okay, they do. So first name and last name. and I'm going to put a div around this so it drops to a new line. So you can notice with this placeholder here, I've just passed in a prop, and it's going to pass that prop to the text field there. All right, so we have a nice simple little form here: first name, last name, and submit. Like how we did with this field, and we simplified having to pass in the handle change, they have a little utility for the form as well, so you don't have to pass in a handle submit if you want. So I can get rid of this, and I can use uppercase form here, and now I can import form from Formik. And so that will automatically pass the prop for you underneath the hood. So still type and submit the form still works. So awesome. So that is basically an intro to Formik and with the text fields. Let's talk about some other fields that you may want to do. So for example, let's start with a checkbox. So I'm going to say field name. The checkbox here is, I'm going to call it is tall. And the type is going to be a checkbox. And so I'm going to say is tall is false. And here we can see, right, we have now rendered a checkbox. Now it's an ugly checkbox again, so we can pass in our as field and pass in a Material UI checkbox if we like. And yeah, okay. And let's just bring this down. And so we now have a nice Material UI checkbox that is mapped to the is tall property, and we can trigger it on and off like that. So that was pretty easy, right? Now let's do another one. Let's do cookies, which is an array. So now cookies here, these are all the available cookies that you may want to eat. So this is a case where I might want to accept multiple checkboxes because I might want to eat multiple cookies. So I'm going to map cookies, the property here, the same name goes here. And now I'm going to set a value. And I'm just going to set a div above this so I can see the difference. So cookies. All right, so I'm going to have a value here. This is going to be chocolate chip. Now to make another checkbox option, you notice I'm going to keep the name exactly the same but change the value. So chocolate chip and snickerdoodle. I feel like that's probably 2 words. I actually don't even know. Now let's go with 1 word. And lastly, we're going to just do sugar. So I'll give that a save. And now we can see I have 3 here, and you can see now my cookies is an empty array, and now I can checkbox this. I can now add a chocolate chip to the cookie that I want to eat. I can also add snickerdoodle, and I now have sugar. All right, so now I can check off which ones I want to eat. But so you notice this is kind of like a checkbox group that I just created here. So let's go over how I just created that, right? So step 1, and my initial value, this doesn't actually matter what your initial value is, but I set it as an empty array. But you want to make sure this name is going to be lining up with this name here, right? So all of these have the same name, and then to differentiate their option, I just changed their values, right? And then as is just we're using our Material UI checkbox there. Now maybe we only want them to eat 1 cookie, or maybe we have a new field which let's call it yogurt. Yogurt. And it's going to be empty by default. Let's bring this down. And my yogurt field here, I might want to make it a radio button. So that's another popular field. So I'm going to make this type radio. And the value, this is going to be peach. And again, all I have to do to make this a radio group, if you will, is to use the same name and then change the value. So this is going to be blueberry, and this is going to be apple. I don't know who eats apple yogurt. That sounds kind of weird. And here as my property, I could leave this blank. and we'll just get the default radio buttons. And you can notice here, right, it only lets me select one value: peach, blueberry, apple. And if I want to, I can do my as property, and I can pass in my radio component. Radio. And my radio component is coming from Material UI. So all you have to do is you have to have a UI component that accepts the properties that a radio accepts. So on change, checked, that sort of thing. And now you can see we got these guys right here. I can select, and I can see the difference. So that's pretty cool. So those are just 3 different ways now that it's quite easy to set up radios and checkboxes in Formik 2 now. Now, the other thing that I want to mention here is usually you don't just make radio fields where we can't see the labels. But if I go to Material UI, if I look at how you actually make a dude here, a form control label, it looks like this. I set the value here, and then I set the control like that. And so this doesn't really map cleanly with our on change, on blur events, because we need to also pass in like this random control radio here, and we could probably get to work, but it's a little odd. So what we can do is we can actually create custom fields, and we can map these properties. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to create a new field up here, which I'm going to call my radio. And actually, before we get into that, let's just render what we want to render. So what I want my radio to render is this form control label. And so for props, I want to take the label, which is just going to be a string, and that's what I'm going to display here. And then the value is going to be, now the control, that can be like that. Now the value and all the other variables are going to be custom depending on what our form looks like, because we want this to be generic. So we're going to take some other props in here that we're kind of going to pass to our form control. Now I'm just going to import this from Material UI. And now to hook into Formik, we're going to say use field. So this is a Formik hook. And here we pass in props. So this could be, for example, the name that we want associated to this. And we're going to see how we use this in a second. And so what this will return is a field property and a meta property. So if I say field dot, I can see all the things I have available to me. So now it's going to pass in a generic value, so field dot value, and a generic on change. And you can see I can one by one pass in all these different fields, or I can simplify my life and I can just, I can do dot 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 field. So Formik is going to pass in all those props for us that handle updating the fields. And then meta has, for example, whether there's an error in this field and some other metadata. We're going to deal with meta in a second. For now, we can ignore this property. I'm just going to delete it. Now, if you're using TypeScript, so ignore this for JavaScript guys for a second, and we want to get the props lined up for this. So I'm going to say type my radio props. I'm going to create an object which has a label, which is a string. And then the props that we can pass to use field, if I hit command and then click on this, I can actually see what it expects. So it expects either a string or field attributes. I'm going to use this field attributes. So I'm going to do and field attributes. And that's going to be the props. So here I can say React.fc is my radio props. Now this takes the field props, passes in, you need to pass in, it is a generic, so you need to pass in a value. I'm just going to pass in an empty object here. I'm not exactly sure what we're supposed to be passing in, but empty object seems to work. And when I click on the type definition for this, when we were looking at it, you can see the generic that it takes here. It just ands it together anyway. So I didn't really need any extra props, but it looks like you could pass in other props you need here. All right, so I think what is just telling me it's not used yet. Nope, it's not used yet. All right, so let's use my radio button here. So I'm going to come down here, and now I'm going to use my radio. And actually, I don't need to pass it in as this as anymore. I just actually render my radio like this. So I'm going to pass in the name, which is yogurt, The type, it's a radio field. The value is peach, and the label's peach. All right, and let's see, did I mess? Nope, we didn't mess anything up. So I'm going to create 3 properties like this, and here's where I'm going to say blueberry, and then I'm going to also do apple. All right, we'll get rid of these 2. And so we got our radio group here to decide what flavor yogurt we want. Let's go check it out. And now I can see I have my nice labels on them, and I can select the one I want. So pretty sweet. So whenever you have a field that does not map to your UI component simply, this is what you'll do. You create a custom component like so, and then to get access to any of the Formik properties, we use the use field. All right, so let's look at another example of when we may want to use this. For example, when we want to do validation and show an error. So for example, let's do it with the first name field here. So I'm going to create another one here called my text field. And what I want to render is a Material UI text field. And I want to be able to display errors or any kind of validation. So, okay, so how am I going to do this? So we're going to use our use field component, or sorry, hook. We're going to have field here. We're going to pass all the field functions to our text field. And then we're going to have a prop here. Well, just props. And we can pass that in here, because I don't need anything extra like a label for this particular one. And then here I'm going to say React.fc, and I'm going to say field attributes. And again, this part is for just TypeScript stuff. And we have to pass in the same generic to my use field, so they're happy. And so now we're going to use this meta field here, meta. So if I click on meta, we can see that it has the error and whether it was touched. So usually what you'll do is I'll say const error text is equal to if there's an error and it's been touched, aka they've actually typed something in the field usually, or they've clicked into the field, then we can display the error, otherwise just do an empty string. And so here I'm going to pass in, actually I think my text field, I actually forget how you even do, let's go just look this up real quick. In Material UI, how you actually display actually I don't want the component API, I want a component. So what I want to do is underneath the text field, just display an error. So this one. So if I click on this, I'm thinking I don't just pass in a prop, that I have to do this helper text. So error, default, label. Looks like I want incorrect entry. All right, so it's helper text is the field name. Helper text is going to be my error text. And then here, I believe error is a boolean that I pass in. It looks like it's any. I think error, let's see if I don't pass anything to my error field. I think it's just not going to turn red. All right, but let's now use my text field. And I'm going to pass these properties in. All right, so we haven't added any validation to Formik yet, so we shouldn't see any difference. It should just work as a normal text field right now. Now you notice the placeholder went away. It's because we're passing all the props into use field. So we may want to do placeholder like that and pass our placeholder in here. All right, so we can see our placeholders back. I can type normally. Now let's talk about validation. So in Formik, I can say validate, and this is a function that takes the current data or the current values in your form. It's called values. And you can return an object with any errors that it possibly has. So usually what I do is you can create a object here called errors, and then I can say if values.firstName.includes Bob, I'm going to say errors.firstName is equal to no Bob, and then I return errors. So if you didn't find any errors, all you do is you pass an empty object back. Otherwise, you put the key of the field that has an error in it and then the message. So you can also get what the errors are here. So this is another thing that I find helpful to just print out in a preview field. And that way I can see what the values are. Okay. So we're going to be displaying the errors. Oh, it looks like I have a problem here. Oh yeah. As far as TypeScript goes, I'm just going to say this is of type any. We could make this a record. Actually, let's do some good practices. Let's make this a record. If you're using TypeScript, this is probably how I would do it. Alright, so that should be happy with us now. So now with my first name here, it's totally fine. And if I look at the error object here, it's empty. But notice now I've typed Bob. It tells us no Bob here, and we can see that this is what our error object looks like. So we actually are seeing error here. Now it's not red, and that's where I think I pass in error to make it red. So error text. So here I'm casting this string to a boolean. So it's going to be true or false. So if this string is empty, it's going to be false. There is no error. But if there is some error text, this should return true. So now when I type in the first name Bob, we get our error message, and it's now in red. Perfect. All right, so the other thing that I wanted to mention is one way to validate is with this function that you just saw, and this we can put arbitrary logic inside of. Another way is with yup. So yup is a library that I'm going to import. And yup, we can create a schema. So it looks something like this. I'm not going to go too much into how yup actually works, but just show you how the integration with Formik works if you want to learn about it. So we're going to say yup.object, and here we can pass in keys that match our object here, our values. So I'm going to say first name, and then I'm going to display any kind of, or I can add any kind of validation I want here. So in this case, I'm going to say this is a string, it's required, and it needs to be a max of 10 characters. All right, we'll give it a save. I can also pass in error messages if I want here. They also have some default ones that I'm going to use. So then instead of using this, I can comment this out. By the way, command or control / you can group comment out in VS Code. And here I'm going to say validation schema, and just pass this in. So validation schema. Alright, so I'll give that a save. Now I'll come over here. Now we have some different rules. So if I leave this blank, it's going to be upset. So you can see I clicked in and I clicked out of, and so that will trigger the error. You can also try submitting. That will trigger the error. So just to refresh, show you again, try to submit, and it being empty, you can see it's required. And I can do a really long one. First name must be at most 10 characters. So there you go. So it can validate using yup as well. All right, so the next thing that I wanted to show you, that was validation, is how can we handle an array of fields. So for example, actually let's start with initial values. Let's say I want to add some pets. And so my pets is going to be an array. And let's say this array is not so simple. Like let's say it has an object inside of it. So maybe we have the type of the pet, for example, maybe a cat, and then the name of the pet, like Jarvis. All right. And so I want to be able to add more pets and display form fields for this so they can update the name or the type. So let's see how we can do that. And I just realized now I never went through how to do select fields in Formik. So this is perfect. We'll do a select field with our cat example here. All right, so the first thing is just there is a component in Formik called field array. And it is a render prop as well. So we're going to do this style of rendering the component. And again, this was auto-imported from me from Formik, or I thought it was. Field array. There we go. And here we pass in the prop name. So this lines up with the name that we have as our top level key. So in this case, the array name is pets. So I'm going to say pets here. And this has some array helper functions. Specifically, if I control space this, we can see ones like, for example, move, push, swap. I believe there's a delete, or here it is, remove as well. So there's some helpful fields when you're dealing with array stuff, which we're about to see. We are going to use some of these guys. And actually, I'm going to move this field. I want this above my submit. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to display a div, and I'm going to say values.pets, and I'm just going to map over my pets, and for each pet we're going to display a form field. So we're going to say key, and I'm going to say pet.name. Now I probably wouldn't use the pet name as a key usually, but for now this should be fine. Now inside of here I'm going to display our my text field. And so if we go back up to where we created this before, we can use a placeholder if we want, a name, and a type. I don't actually think the type is really necessary in this case also, now that I think about it. I think we just need to pass in really the name and then if we want a placeholder. So I'm going to copy these and we will add it to our text field. So in this case, my name, this is actually going to be kind of special, so we're going to deal with the name in a second. And the placeholder, I'm just going to say pet name. Now here I want to return like this. So what I just did there is wrap this in curly braces. So now we return like this. And this allows us to now put some stuff here, because I'm going to say const name. We're going to create this here. So what the name is we build it like this. So we say pets, because that is our array key. Then we say dot, and we specify the index, which you can get from mapping. And then we say at this index which name. In this case, it's going to be called name. And then we pass that in here. And so what that maps to is, if we scroll up to our pets, so it's going to be pets.0.name maps to Jarvis, for example. And so that's how you create the mapping for the name to the field. All right, now let's create another field. And I'm going to be using the field component here because we're actually going to be using a select field. So I'm going to say type is select. And then I'm going to say as. And here I'm actually going to use the select field from Material UI. So select. And so here I can put the options for my select field. In this case, they're going to be menu items. That's just how the name that Material UI uses. So in this case, I'm going to say cat, dog, or frog. All right, so this is how you can do a select field in Formik. So it actually will map everything for you, which is quite nice. And this is another one where we need to create a name. So here I'm going to, I'm just going to get rid of the const actually. We can just directly pass it in like this. That way I don't have to create two names up there as variables because I can't think of any good names for them. All right, so we're going to do this in a similar structure. We say pets dot the index. And then here, this particular one is called type. All right, so type matches with what I called it up here. In this case, cat. All right, so let's just see where we are with this. So right now it looks like I can see my Jarvis name here, and I can see that it's a cat. I can also pick a different field, frog and whatnot, and I can also type here. And something's weird because whenever I type, it actually loses focus of the field. I don't know if it's something with Chill UI. Okay, I see why we're getting this problem. It's because I used the pet name as a key. Now that I think about it, that's actually a terrible key because it changes every time I type a letter. And so that's what I'm getting this choppiness for. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is give these things IDs. And I'm just going to say math.random to generate this ID. and that way we have a nice stable ID. Alright, so we'll save this, come back here. Now I should be able to change Jarvis to Ron. Cool, and that works perfect. Alright, so I can see here's my pets object, my array of pets. Now we're going to add some stuff to be able to add fields to this. So let's say a button up here, and I'm going to add this right here. Add pet, and when I click on this, I'm going to call my array helpers, and we're going to call the push. And so I'm going to pass in a empty pet object. So here I'm going to say the type is frog by default, the name is empty, and the ID is equal to a math.random call. And I'm putting the string, empty string, and plussing it to cast this to a string. Alright, so let's add a pet. Ron is a dog. Add another pet, Jimmy. And we can see as I'm doing that, we can see now our pet object with stuff inside of here. And next thing I want to do is just add a delete button. So we're going to add a little X here. So use our material button. On click, and we're going to say array helpers. Let's bring this up. Dot remove, and pass in the index. So now when I click on the X, it's going to remove the particular row based on the index. Alright, so let's say we don't care about Jarvis. I can click the X, and now we can see our pets is totally empty. Let's add a pet. Let's add a pet. AB, and he's going to be a cat. And I can remove them both. So there you go. That is how we can add, remove. Now there's some other array helpers you can use functions. I'm not going to go over them. That gives you the gist of how you can do this. One last thing that I just wanted to touch on was how error messages and errors and validation works on the array fields. So for that, I could write validation. And actually, why don't I do this type of validation instead of the validation schema for now. And so for this, actually, it's actually kind of tedious to do this. Let's do a validation schema for simplicity's sake, and I'll show you in the pre-tag what it looks like. So I'm going to say pets, and I'm going to say yup.array .of yup.objects, and the name yup.string is required. So we'll give that a save. So I've made this now a required field here. So if I try adding pets and I submit, you'll notice here it's going to tell me that you have to add those required fields for the pet name. Now, how was I easily able to map all this stuff together with like just me adding the validation here? Well, so what happened there is yup went ahead and validated it, and this is the structure of the error. All right, so pets, it's an array, and inside the array here we have objects and name, and you see how it matches the same structure as our values. So this is how you would structure your error if you wanted to pass back an error for an array. And so it's an array of objects and the name and then a string of what the error message is. And so what happens is Formik automatically uses the names to line this up. So it says pets at index 1 with the name property. So you can see it right here. This is the name we have for it. Lines up. So the name and the error line up, and that's how Formik matches them up. But there you go. That is how you can do error messages with an array as well. So one way is to create with yup like this, or you can create your own custom object structure like this in the validate function. But there you go. This video is turning out quite long, but I hope that was a good introduction into Formik 2 and Formik in general of how you can do various form things and build different types of forms. This is still pretty much an introduction. There are several different things you may want to touch on, fields and properties to help you out, but this should give you a good structure to begin trying out Formik.